Hello and welcome to this video where I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I approach inspecting blocks of flats. There's some of those general principles, some of those kind of ideas that hopefully you guys might be able to use and might make it a little bit easier for you. Just to give you a little bit of background, so my name is Tim Kenny. I'm a residential surveyor and I've been doing that for quite a few years now. But before that, I was a property manager. So I looked after blocks of flats, responsible for the maintenance and upkeep and the management of these flats. So I kind of, I've done a lot of looking at flats in a couple of different contexts. So I'm going to talk you through kind of how I approach it, how I look at the process, and hopefully you guys will find that interesting and useful. Right, so what am I going to be talking about in this video? Well, what we're really going to be covering is firstly, why should a client get a survey on a flat? And there's some good reasons for that, and I'll try and explain those as we go through as well. How blocks of flats are usually managed. Now, as somebody who has managed lots of different blocks of flats, I can tell you that usually is a kind of a probably a slightly unsafe word. So the way they actually should be managed is in regards to the terms of a lease, and not all leases are the same. They have their own specific details and clauses. So we can't ever say for certain unless we've seen a lease what's actually going on. But I'm going to talk to you about some reasonably safe assumptions. Um, and kind of one of those, I'm going to talk about it really specifically in terms of windows, just because I think it gives you a good insight into how you can approach more things generally as well. How do you decide if a communal issue is a CR3? A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is about the kind of the block and the communal bits of it. Not too worried about the inside of a flat. The inside of a flat is very similar to the inside of a house in a lot of ways. You look at what you can look at and you report in a very similar way. But things do change when you step outside the door of the flat and you're in the hallways or in the communal grounds or looking at the big building itself. And there's a slight little kind of key issue around how you might identify a CR3, so a condition rating 3. And we'll talk about that in relation to a little bit of legislation as well. What should you inspect? How far should you take your inspection of a block of flats? We'll look at that a little bit. I'm also going to look at a bit of this health and safety stuff. It's quite a big issue in relation to flats, and we're going to touch on some of those key things, some of those things you might find really useful. So first up, how are flats usually managed? And you can see there's a little kind of little diagram there that I've tried to kind of sort of pictorialize the setup there and hopefully make it a little bit clearer. So you're probably aware that in essence for a leasehold property, so a flat, most flats are generally leasehold. We do have common hold, not much of that around, and that's a whole different discussion. So I'm just going to stick to leasehold today. But you're going to be aware that there has to be a freeholder and then there's a leaseholder. Generally speaking, the freeholder owns the freehold of the building and the land and everything else, and then the leaseholder has a lease to occupy their section of it, usually referred to as a flat or an apartment. So that's quite simple when you've got just those two parties. The reality is you very rarely just have those two parties. Might usually be for a small flat, maybe you've got two flats and maybe a converted house or something like that. But for more bigger purpose-built blocks, you may find there's a kind of other couple of parties involved. First one of those is the residence management company, used to refer to as an RMC or just a management company. That will be a limited company for which all of or a good number of the leaseholders will also be shareholders. So when we kind of talk about maybe a share of freehold, what they're usually referring to is a share of a management company which may own the freehold. Each individual does not individually own a section of the freehold. They own a section of a company which in turn owns the freehold. So that's the residence management company. Now, of course, it is possible that the management company doesn't own the freehold. So you can also have a freeholder, residence management company, and then the leaseholders. And again, that usually happens where there's been what we call a right to manage. So the leaseholders have collectively got together and taken away the responsibility of management of the property from the freeholder. Just to confuse things, another stage, you might also see managing agents. These are essentially as they're described. They are an agent appointed by either the freeholder or the management company to actually do the day-to-day work of managing and maintaining and collecting the service charge and looking after the building. Right? And I think it's really important to get these three terms right. I mean, we all know what a leaseholder is. That's a relatively easy one. The three terms of freeholder, residence management company, and managing agents, I quite often see confused, obviously by buyers and clients and even leaseholders, but also actually quite a lot of property professionals tend to confuse them as well. And I think it really is quite important that we do get these terms right in our report. You actually have an obligation under the Home Survey Standards to advise the client on who should carry out works. Now, usually in a house, that might be the type of contractor they might seek to employ. But actually, if you're talking about repairs to a communal element of a building, you need to be telling them that the responsibility is likely to be that of the freeholder / management company. Right? Always going to be freeholder / management company, never the managing agents. The managing agents may do the work, but they're not directly responsible for it. They take their instruction from the freeholder or the management company. It's just quite clear to get those distinctions. Now, it may well be that the leaseholder pays their money to the managing agent, and the managing agent collects a service charge from them, and they kind of think there's this direct relationship. There's not. The managing agent is responsible only to the freeholder or the management company. So it's the management company that is always the responsible party, and that's who we should be referencing when we're including it in our reports. Next thing I'm going to talk about is this idea of how do you decide if a communal issue is a CR3. And there's a really useful little bit of legislation that I tend to apply when it comes to this concept. And that is Section 20 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, brackets, as amended by Section 151 of the Commonhold and Leasehold Reform Act 2002, which is a bit of a mouthful, but essentially what this section of the Landlord and Tenant Act, as it's been amended, says that a landlord in this case can be either the freeholder or the management company, whoever is undertaking the responsibilities of the landlord, as set out in the lease. So the landlord must consult on any works that will cost an individual leaseholder £250 or more. Right? So we could get into the minutiae of how service charges are worked out and apportionment of service charges and all that sort of thing. Don't really need to worry about that too much. But put in simple terms, if you've got a block of 4 flats and you want to do any work that's going to cost you more than £1,000 or more than £999, then you're going to need to go through a consultation process as set out in law. It's not a particularly onerous consultation process. It doesn't. I don't want to get into a kind of a long conversation about the usefulness of Section 20, but what it does mean is that it automatically kicks in a delay. Right? There's a consultation process. You have to put a notice out to the leaseholder saying you're going to do the work, saying we're going to do the work, asking if they want to recommend a contractor. Once you've done that, you then have to go away and get quotes, and then you have to send off another notice saying you've got the quotes, and there's this process that you go through. Realistically, the quickest you can move through that process is about 3 months because of the notice periods involved and everything else. Usually it means longer. So that means that if there is some work that needs doing that's going to cost more than £1,000, for example, in this 4-block flat, even if that money is going to come from service charge funds that have already been collected, so for example, stored in a reserve fund, what people mistakenly refer to as a sinking fund. It's a reserve fund, money collected to do works. Even if you're going to take it from that, you still have to put out the notices. So if you've, for example, got a roof leak and you're going to need to put up scaffolding, and the contractor's going to need to get up there and fix that problem, then if that work is going to cost £1,000, you're going to have to go out through the consultation process and you're going to have that delay there, which means obviously it causes a problem. And that's why I kind of say, okay, well, if I feel a defect, a property is going to cost more than £250 times the number of flats. So if there's 4, then it's £1,000. If there's 10, it's 250, 2,500, and so on if your maths is good enough. So at that point, I would say, okay, well, therefore there's going to be a consultation process, and the law has already said anything more than £250 is a significant expenditure. So therefore, for me, that pushes it into a CR3, condition rating 3. Now, obviously, yes, you have so for example, you've used the SAVA protocol. That'll give you a different route to coming to a conclusion. But I just think this is just a little extra thing that you can put into your thinking process, because it is backed up by Landlord and Tenant Act. It says that's a significant cost. So if I think it's going to cost more than £250, then I'm going to have to put it in as a CR3. While we're kind of on this subject, this is kind of perhaps a good time to talk about why I think it's really important that we should be encouraging people buying flats to have a survey. So you kind of know that a service charge is generally speaking is collected, and that then is spent to maintain and look after the building. Right? And that's great. That kind of, most people go, okay, well that's fine. I pay my service charge. They look after it. I haven't got to worry about it. If there's any defects, they're going to fix that for me. And to a certain extent, that's true. The problem comes there. I would say, well, yes, they're going to fix it, but if the cost of fixing it is more than they've collected in the service charge, they're going to have to ask you for it. They're going to have to ask you for the extra. A service charge, as collected, is not guaranteed to cover all the costs that need to be met. So if you're going to spend more than you've collected, you need to ask for that from the leaseholders, and the leaseholders have to pay it. Now, obviously, there are systems in place to protect them, but they're not great. So if your landlord tells you you need to pay a certain amount of money to do some works at a property, you pretty much have no choice but to pay it. Right? And the way I tend to explain this to people, that let's come back to kind of our roof leak example. So if you buy a house and the roof is leaking, you as the individual can choose to put a bucket underneath it, can't you? You can collect the water in the bucket, and you can go up there every time it rains, and you can empty that bucket, and you can delay works if you can't afford to carry them out straight away. If you don't immediately have the money, you can delay the works, you can collect up that money, and you can get it done, or you could just patch it up, or you can manage it and try and organise it that way. It's not the same when you buy a flat. If there's a roof leak, it's the landlord, so the freeholder or the management company, who decides when that work gets done. Right? In fact, they have a legal obligation to get the work done. They should get it done as soon as practically possible. So they will go ahead and do that. If there isn't money in the service charge kitty to pay for it, they will then issue a demand out to all the leaseholders, saying, okay, well, we've done this work. It cost us, £1,000 more than we had per flat. So please give us our £1,000. They'll issue that additional service charge demand, and the leaseholder has to find the £1,000. Whether they have it or not, they've had the demand. They've got an obligation to pay it. If they don't pay it, there can be interest and charges on top of that until such point as they do pay it. Even if they can't pay it over a long time, then the management company or the freeholder, the landlord, can go to court to recover it. So they can end up with a CCJ against them, all because there was a roof leak that they couldn't check. They couldn't control when it was repaired. So, put simply, you should get a survey on a flat because you do not control how and when expenditure is made on that property. So therefore, you really need to understand it, because you're taking on the obligation without any control. If you buy a house, you take on the obligation, but you have more of the control over what's done and when it's done. So that's kind of what I tend to tell clients when they're thinking about whether they should have a survey on their flat. That's probably enough of me talking about legislation and money. So let's look at some actual flats themselves and some bits and pieces and some of the kind of the thought process that I'm having. So here we have relatively modern purpose-built block. We've got 3 stories, and just to kind of quickly cover off, I'm not going to get into kind of the Building Safety Act stuff and cladding of bits and pieces today. That is a whole different kettle of fish. Truth is, if you don't already understand that, then you probably should be backing away from those properties anyway. I'm going to stick to kind of simply more sort of simplified properties such as this one. As you can see, no cladding on this one. Nice, relatively low-rise block, so nothing we're too concerned about at this stage. So say, yeah, purpose-built, 3-story property. In this case, I was inspecting one on that kind of that first floor, so a middle floor flat. I think off to the right from memory, right rear, I think. So there's 2 things that I'm immediately going to be thinking about when I'm looking at the front of the property and looking at all the external elements of it. It's, okay, what am I actually going to be looking at? How much of this can I get at to inspect? And also, how much of it is kind of relevant to inspect? So here we have one flat within a wider development, one block, sorry, within a wider development. There's actually, I think, 4 other blocks on this development. Now, it's actually theoretically possible, and I have seen leases written this way, that will make a leaseholder in, say, for example, this block, responsible for a share of maintenance and management of all of the blocks. So you say there was, for example, there was 10 in each block, they would pay 1/40th of managing all four of them, maintaining all four of them. So there is, theoretically, it could be possible that you would say, okay, well, actually, a surveyor carrying out a survey should have to look at all four of those properties, all four of those blocks of flats, because your client might be taking on a responsibility for all four of those blocks of flats. That's obviously quite an extreme example, and I've not seen many. I had maybe about two, I think, and they generally speaking were older properties and set up in slightly odd ways. So I tend to take the view that if a block is physically distinct and separate from another block, I would just look at that physically distinct and separate property. Now, the wider grounds, you might want to do a walk around of all of the wider grounds containing all of the blocks. But if it's physically separate, generally speaking, and again, leases aren't all identical. So when you're looking in general terms, generally speaking, and I think it's a relatively safe assumption, you will only look at the physically separate block. No obligation to look at the other three blocks, for example, on this estate. You're only going to look at this one. Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated when you've got maybe attached blocks with separate entrances. But I think it's worth, whatever you do, note down why. So on this one, I would say, okay, well, I have excluded the other floor blocks because this one is physically separate, so I've made a reasonable assumption on that. If there was an attached block, but it had its own entrance and there was no physical, real connection between them other than just being adjoining on two walls, I would probably do that. And again, I'd write down within my site notes my assumption, and I make that assumption clear within my report as well. So my client knows what I've looked at, and they know what I haven't looked at. Another principle that we do need to factor in when we're carrying out our inspection is privacy. So if you're inspecting a house, you can, obviously, the occupier should know you are there. You can inform them what you're doing and talk them through what's happening and everything else. Here you can't. You're not going to go around and knock on every single flat and tell every single flat owner what's happening here. So you're perhaps not going to walk right up close to the walls where someone's window is. We do have to respect the privacy of the other occupiers of this building. So maybe we do need to inspect more from distance than just getting straight up to it. And again, that kind of also coincides with where you point your camera and what pictures you take and how close you might get. So as I said, if I'm inspecting a flat that happens to be the two windows on the far left, for example, on that middle floor, I might take close-up pictures of those, but I'm not going to take close-up pictures of the windows above, because ultimately you're just looking into somebody's windows, and that could be a little bit problematic, let's say. Same kind of applies if you're going to use a pole camera or drones and these things. They're not safe to use without prior notification. A property like this. So we have to back off. And again, note that in your site notes, note that in your report, that you are inspecting more from distance because in the interest of privacy. Whilst we're talking about windows, the other thing I like to think about is okay, who owns the windows? And this seems like and again, we kind of went into that area of, okay, well, how much do you inspect? Where's the responsibility lie? So leases tend to be written in one or two ways. They either make the windows the responsibility of the individual flat, or they make the windows a communal responsibility. And again, no way you can know, because unless you've seen a copy of the lease and you've gone through it with a fine-tooth comb and picked out that information, you don't know as a surveyor who's just rocking up to the property and doing your job. So I tend to say, okay, well, look, if all of the windows are the same, if the property is of a reasonable age where people might have started replacing windows, and all of the windows are the same, then I will assume those windows are a communal responsibility, right? If they're all identical, they've all been changed, for example, and they've all been changed to the same window, that very distinctly implies there's a communal responsibility. There's some joint action that's been carried out to replace those windows. But if all the windows are starting to change individually, we're seeing lots of different ones, you get some timber and some UPVC and everything else, then that implies that there are going to be a leaseholder responsibility as opposed to a communal responsibility. And this is important because you need to kind of have an idea of the general condition of the windows, and so the flat windows, the windows of the apartment you're particularly inspecting, you're going to inspect those in a good detail, And if they are different from everything else, and therefore you've made the reasonable assumption that you've written down in your site notes, you've written down in your report that they might belong to that flat, you'll inspect them closely and you'll say, okay, yep, these are fine, or they've got a problem, whatever it is you're going to say about them. But if they're all the same, then you kind of actually have to have a general look at all of the windows as much as possible. Because it might be that the 2 windows to your flat, for example, are absolutely fine, and 75% of the rest of them are knackered. And if they're knackered, they're going to have to be replaced. As we said, that the cost of that comes from the service charge, and it may well be that the landlord has not been collecting a reserve fund to pay for those windows, even though they knew it was going to need to be doing. And it could be that your client moves in, and a week later they get a service charge demand for their share of replacing all of the windows to the entire building, even though their windows are fine. It may well then be, okay, well, they've suddenly got this bill for, even if it's 250 quid or 150 quid. They're going to phone you up and say, well, why didn't you tell me that everything else's windows were knackered and I might have to pay this? So sometimes it seems quite minor, but actually that is really worth thinking about when you're inspecting a block of flats. So I'm going to run through some of the kind of key things you really do want to check. And this comes from my old days as a property manager, really. And these are the things that I would always check walking around a building. And that's things like fire doors and self-closers. So, you're probably all aware of the significance of fires within flats, and there's lots of conversations around cladding and these different kind of issues. Well, we know compartmentalization really is a key factor. I had blocks where we had fires in individual flats, and actually somebody not that far away didn't even notice because it was so contained within the flat, and that's what's supposed to happen, right? But if we find that we are having fire doors that are left open, or we're having self-closers that are damaged, and they do get damaged, they can't use badly, or things, the doors are propped open and they fail and they start to leak and the fluid falls out and the arms break and everything else. So really they are quite key. You're going to walk around all of the internal communal areas, which you should be doing, opening and closing the doors. If you find doors that are not being left open, or self-closers that are damaged, that really is a key thing to flag up in your report, because there is a significant risk with that. 2 things to note here. Obviously, on the kind of that top left-hand corner, we've got what is an emergency light. So again, get familiar with what the kind of typical emergency systems are within a block of flats. So this is emergency lighting. When the power goes, this lighting comes on. They're always usually indicated by a little green light. Should have a little sticker on them saying when they were last serviced and maintained. But make sure you can see them. If you see them, note they're there. Again, you should be identifying these key services, these key life-saving services at a property. Learn what a dry riser is. Learn what a wet riser is. Learn what a smoke vent looks like within a block of flats. Go on the internet, Google these things, understand these things if you don't already. And again, you're not specifically checking that they're operational or they're working, but you should at least be able to recognize them. You should be able to tell your client a list of the likely services that are in place and these life-saving services. And you should be telling them that they need to make sure that there is servicing and maintenance of these services being carried out by the landlord, so the freeholder or the management company. Are they maintaining these things? Because it's all well and good having them there, but if they're not maintained, they don't work when they need to, and you've got a problem. So again, something you need to flag up to your client that they should then be checking as part of the conveyancing process. Second thing here, we've got an access hatch into the loft. Quite simply, it's locked, you can't get up there, right? So unless the access hatch is from the subject property, if you're inspecting a top floor flat and it has a hatch that gives access into a section of the roof space, and it usually will be their section of the roof space, their right to access, then you can go up and inspect that bit. I would not inspect anything off a communal hatch, whether it's locked or unlocked, mainly again because you can't control access through these areas. And kind of the same applies for me with inspection chambers. I'm always very reluctant to lift inspection chambers, so manhole covers, in communal estates, in communal areas, because again, you can't control the way people are moving around there. There is safety risks in pulling up any kind of cover. There's safety risks in going up a ladder up into an access hatch, and we can't control the space well enough to protect ourselves and protect others around us, so we have to leave them well alone. Last couple of slides now. So this one is a notice board. It's quite obvious what it is. It's a notice board, but this is quite useful to kind of, certainly you should be having a look at these. You should be looking for evidence that there's some form of escape plan on there. You should be looking for evidence of the managing agent's details, if there is one, or the freeholder's contact details. Usually there should be a certificate of public liability insurance in place as well. And you don't need to know on this. You don't need to be checking all of these things and the validity of all these things. But I think for me, it's quite useful to identify that it's there. And again, note it in your report for the client. Say, there is a notice board. It contains information about the management and maintenance of your building. Please make sure you look at it and understand all of those details. I also generally tend to say, look, there's a notice board. It's got lots of these things on it. That is an indication of good management. It's not a guarantee, but it does indicate that there's been some effort to communicate with tenants and to do the job properly. And if it's not there, that for me immediately flags up a red flag. Now, I'm not going to say to my client, there's no notice board, it's a problem. But it does kind of kick into my brain, okay, well, I'm going to look a little bit more closely at some things because, I don't have an engaged landlord. I don't have an engaged managing agent who might be proactively taking care of their building. Therefore, I'm more likely to find problems. And we know from, for example, Hart and Large, if we are seeing something that starts to flag up a red flag, we do need to poke a little bit deeper. And we can really apply that same concept here if we're not seeing things like this. Right, last one here. So we have a notice board. It's got not got much on it, but actually I'm happier to see this one because it's got that little red pack underneath it that you can see says important fire safety documents. It's red, it says important on it, it must be important, and it is. It's a little pack of information that will include records of servicing of all those life-saving equipment that I mentioned earlier on. It will tell you when the emergency lights were serviced. It will tell you when the fire alarms and the smoke detectors were last tested. It'll probably include a health and safety risk assessment and a fire risk assessment. Older properties will also include an asbestos risk assessment. Now, again, we as the surveyor carrying out maybe a level 2 survey wouldn't be expected to fully digest all of this information and report back on the validity of it. But actually, we should have a look at it. We should go through it. We should go through that pack and say, okay, well, look, this is a health and safety risk assessment here, and I can see that none of these risks have been dealt with. Okay, well, there must be that's again another massive red flag, and again, you can go around and you can check physically because that risk assessment should have information about those risks. It might even have pictures, so you can go and check that quite easily. Same with the asbestos register. Again, you've got a register there that tells you what probably contains asbestos. It tells you whether it's been left in place and what its condition is. You can quickly cross-check that in your inspection as well. And importantly, if you're not seeing that, that is something you might want to flag up to your client. So, there are no fire safety documents stored within the communal areas that you can access. That is a concern. You may want to ask the management company or freeholder about this information and why it's not there. So hopefully that gives you some kind of little pointers, some helpful little bits and pieces. I mean, again, there is so much in flats. I've only just tried to kind of condense it down to some of the key bits and hopefully keep this video not too long. But if it was useful to you, that's great. If you've got any other suggestions of things that you want me to kind of try and get across and explain and be helpful, then you can always put in a comment or get in touch and I'll do what I can for you. Thank you very much.